Hey guys, hope that the novelty hasn't worn off too quickly on doing school this way. I know things can get kind of monotonous pretty quickly. Feel like you're doing the same thing day in and day out. For that reason, I'm going to look to shake things up a little bit going forward, try to find ways to kind of change it up slightly for you. Not planning a video for Friday, for instance. Probably very little new work for you to do, just mostly kind of reflecting on what we might have looked at this week. Um, so I'm hoping that we can kind of, make progress, but not drive any one manner of doing this into the ground in the meantime. Today I want to make it a short video. I thought yesterday was a little bit long. I was kind of rushing at the end there. I hope it made sense to you. But we're going to kind of finish giving you the contours of the just war theory today with the second part of the just war theory, which is jus in bello, um, justice in the war itself, conducting the war in a just manner. There's actually fewer stipulations, but as I'm going to try to demonstrate, I think it's the much more difficult line to hold. I think that making a just decision in going to war is generally a little easier to pull off. I mean, there are certainly times where people have gone to war and it wasn't a just decision, but I do think that this is more difficult a line to hold. It's certainly true that war becomes very, very messy. It's highly emotional and heartbreaking and tragic, and that means it's going to be a very hard line to hold to keep it within the boundaries of justice. So let's take a look. Um, as you see there at the top, it says jus in bello means conducting war in a just manner. So the way that you fight, the way that you strategize, the way that your soldiers conduct themselves has to be just for the war to remain just. It could have been a very just cause, but it's possible that you could run into some unjust ways of fighting that war. We're just going to list three of these stipulations, these tenets, although if you looked at different theorists and their understanding of it, you might find longer or shorter lists, depending. We're going to take a look at these three. The first one is that a justly fought war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Simply put, civilians must not be targeted in your strategy for war. Now, obviously, that's challenging. Not only is it challenging, it's probably messier now than ever. One of the things that's true about the just war theory, which we're going to look at tomorrow, is that it was developed in an era where they were still using castles and they were still, you know, easily delineating between those who intended to fight and those who did not intend to fight. And weapons were rather singular in their usage. A arrow shot from a bow, for instance, a spear thrown from a single person's hand. And so delineating between combatants and non-combatants used to be far simpler. In the case of modern warfare, it's just not that way anymore. But what a theorist would say is basically that if taking someone else's life is going to be just, that it that it could be the right thing to do, that it wouldn't violate the commandment "Thou shalt not kill." For that to be true, the person you are fighting against must tacitly acknowledge the possibility of being killed justly, meaning they must also know that they are in a combat zone and are a part of a battle, a war. They must be intentionally participating in the fight. This is maybe mostly made difficult by the fact that if someone surrenders, they immediately become a non-combatant and must be treated as such. And our international governing bodies over the centuries have created things like the Geneva Convention for how prisoners of war should be treated. But I'm sure you could think of wars where those lines simply weren't held. World War II comes to mind, and you don't have to look far to find the mistreatment of soldiers during World War II. And I think mostly you would find that on the side of the Axis powers during World War II, but I think it's also true to find that there are moments where the Allies were not living up to our own standards on that. Second stipulation is that a justly fought war won't use weaponry that's been outlawed by international law. Yet again, this is something that the Geneva Convention has put in place in terms of international law. And the difficulty here is that it doesn't make it right just because your enemy begins to use it. Types of weapons that come to mind include chemical warfare. That's a war crime. Saddam Hussein was guilty of it as a war crime. There are moments in the war in Southeast Europe from the 1990s around Kosovo and in Yugoslavia where chemical warfare was being used. And in those cases, those people were guilty of war crimes. And their guilt did not make it better if the other side began to use chemical warfare as well. It is outlawed and unjust. And then the last one that comes up consistently enough for us to mention is the fact that you must not inflict more suffering than is necessary. Now, this can be very finely parsed out. Actually, I've read ethicists who say that the caliber of bullet ought to be limited so that you're not inflicting more suffering than is necessary to a single person. A 50 caliber bullet does obviously significantly more damage to a human being than a 22 caliber bullet. And so there are ethicists who have thought about it as detailed as that. And you can imagine in the way a war functions, how an arms race might get to sort of spiral out of control and how it'd be a very hard line to hold as you're trying to win a war, to win it in a just manner. For that reason, I think it's the more challenging of the two phases. By way of demonstration, I'd actually like to just sort of think briefly about two wars that I think are most easily recognized as being just in American history. They're not the only two that could fall within the boundaries of the just war theory, but they roll off the tip of the tongue, so to speak. World War II and the American Civil War. But in both cases, there are moments where you can investigate and find the boundaries of the just war theory, especially jus in bello, being pushed, probably being violated, actually. For World War II, the ones that come to mind would be the bombing campaigns. Now, setting aside the atomic weapons, which is an important conversation to have, we just don't have time to have it here. There are a couple of really kind of tragic and devastating bombing campaigns the Allies and specifically the Americans conducted. Most famously would be the firebombing of Tokyo and the bombing of Dresden, Germany. Both of these took place late in the war. Both of them had really no bearing on the outcome of the war. And in both cases, civilians were targeted. Actually, as part of your response today, I just want you to investigate them briefly and kind of give your gut reaction to it. I don't know that we could say that it, entirely reverses the just nature of World War II, but it certainly is something worth fighting back against, that it might not happen again. You'd have to hold that line. Even in the American Civil War, the same kind of thing can be said of Sherman's march. You might know General William Tecumseh Sherman and his march through Georgia and then on to the sea through South Carolina. And part of his goal actually was to really kind of undermine the civilian population and their ability to support an army. And he did significant damage to civilians in that campaign. I'm not asking you to look up that one. That one's a little bit more involved, and the history of it's harder to digest in a quick way. So I want you to focus on the bombing campaigns of World War II and just kind of think, does this push you in one direction or another regarding the entirety of the just war theory, to see how hard the line is to hold? Just think about it for a few moments. After you maybe look up on Wikipedia what happened, jot down a couple of sentences worth of thoughts, and eventually I'd like to take a look at those. But remember, you don't have to send me anything until the end of the unit. I hope you're doing well. I miss being with you guys one day at a time. And hopefully we can all celebrate together all your accomplishments at some point later, heading towards the summer. See you guys.